Good evening. Put yourself in their shoes as best you can. We followed Israel in our scripture reading all the way from the land of Egypt and early Exodus out into the wilderness through the rest of Exodus and Leviticus up to the gate of the promised land in Numbers 13, and then back out into the wilderness for 40 years through Numbers and Deuteronomy, and here they finally are. In Joshua chapter 2, they spy out the land, including primarily the city of Jericho. It's the first objective on the way in. It's the gatekeeper city of the rest of the land. They need to go and take that out first. And so they spy it out. They cross the Jordan River, as we just sung in chapter 3. They cross over, rededicate themselves to the Lord in chapters 3 and 4. Building memorials, reminding themselves of who God is and how he's brought them this far. And then in chapter 5, Joshua is up on the hill in the scripture reading, as we saw. And he sees a man there. He's confused. Is that man for Israel or for Jericho? He's for neither. He's for the Lord. Is Joshua for the Lord? That's the question. And Joshua bows down to him. He's looking out at this land of Jericho. Jericho, here's an aerial view of that location. There's been a lot of work done, excavations, archaeology done for the land. Yeah, sorry, I flipped it on its side. It looks a little bit weird. It'll align better with the picture here in just a second. This is the land of Jericho. You see the modern day city down at the bottom left there. This is what it was imagined to have looked like back in that day. An inner city with an interior wall, an external city with an external wall. A wall that, from approximation, seems to be 20 to 26 feet high. If you need a scale reference, that's about 4 of me stacked on top of each other. I think that's about the height of this ceiling, from rough approximations. But that's not it. Because if you were to walk up to the foot of Jericho, as you can hopefully tell, it's on a little bit of a hill. And hills have a tendency to erode and decay, and so instead they would have built a retaining wall around the foot of it. The retaining wall is estimated to be 12 to 15 feet high. That's another, 2.5 of me standing on top of each other. If you were to stand at the bottom of the walls of Jericho, this is the brick wall. Add another 12 feet to that. 35 to 41 feet in the air. How is Joshua supposed to take care of that? We make fun of the spies in Numbers 13 because they walked into the land and they said, "Oh, the fortifications are great and the people are very big." Yes. Yes, they were. But the point of Joshua chapter 6, if you're not there already, go ahead and turn there. That's where we'll be spending the rest of this evening. The point of Joshua 6 is to explain how it doesn't really matter how tall the walls are, because God can figure that out. In fact, if you looked at some of the archaeology, it seems that sometime in the 1500s or 1400s BC, by the way, Joshua was conquering the land right in the middle of that area, something odd happened to Jericho's wall, and it happened to crumble outwards. Not a usual thing for a conquest. It crumbled outwards and made a little bit of a ramp up the retaining wall. Who knows how that could have happened? And what might have happened after that? Well, it's up to speculation. But there's an ancient story that Joshua 6 records about God stepping in with the city of Jericho, God collapsing the wall, God allowing all the Israelites to walk straight ahead up into the city and burn it to the ground. The first gate in the way into the land of Canaan is gone. It's the power of God. That's what Joshua 6 is. It's probably a story you're familiar with if you've been around church for a while. If not, you'll be familiar with it by the end of tonight. So we're going to go through it and step by step help show some good points and interesting things that God has to say to us through this story. Like any great battle, there's a bit of a battle plan beforehand. There's a discussion of what happens during the actual fight. And then there's a little bit afterwards, a little bit of cleanup and helping to smooth everything over. Those are your three sections: before the battle, after the battle, and during as well. Those are the three sections we'll use to break this story down. And so we'll begin with the first one, which is the first 5 verses of chapter 6. It says, Jericho was strongly fortified, or shut tightly, because of the Israelites. No one was leaving or entering. And the Lord said to Joshua, Look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time, and do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times while the priests blow the trumpets. And when there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear it shout, have all the troops give a mighty shout, and the city wall will collapse, and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead. Here you have God's battle plan. Before the fight actually begins, God steps down and gives Joshua some instructions on how he should go about conquering the city of Jericho. And the first thing you notice about this isn't even something that God says, it's just an observation that Joshua can tell from looking at the city. And the first observation is that God terrifies his enemies. Chapter 6 in verse 1, Jericho is shut tightly. No one's moving in or out. No one's going about their normal day's work. They are all hunkering down because they know exactly what's coming to them. If you remember chapter 2, Rahab the prostitute helped to protect the spies when they came into her city. The spies come in, she hides them in her house, and then she comes to them in Joshua chapter 2 and verse 9. And she says to these Israelite spies, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and the terror of you has fallen on us. And everyone who lives in the land is panicking because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. We've heard what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 Amorite kings that you destroyed across the Jordan. And when we heard this, we lost heart. And everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now swear by the Lord that you keep me alive when this city falls. God terrifies his enemies. That's a message for Israel, and that's a message for today. Sometimes we have a tendency to think that God and his enemies are fighting on even ground. Sometimes there's this idea that God is entirely good and Satan is entirely evil, and they're evenly matched, and one day one of them will win. But if that's your impression of life, then you probably haven't read much of the Bible. Maybe you haven't looked at the book of Revelation, which is all about how God has utterly destroyed his enemy already. Maybe you haven't seen the fact that God created the world and everything in it, and at any point he can uncreate the world and everything in it. Satan is not God's equal fighting on a level playing field. Satan is terrified of God. He can't fight God, and so he fights God's people instead. That's why the solution, when you're fighting with temptation, that's why the solution is to call on God. God scares Satan away. You don't, but God does. He terrifies his enemies. They hide within the walls of Jericho, waiting for the inevitable. And it is inevitable because as God starts out his address to Joshua, he says, I've already won this. In verse 2, he says, Look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. If you're looking at that from outside, you're looking at a 40-foot wall. That doesn't really look like God has won anything yet. But when God says it, he absolutely has, and this battle has already been decided. As you watch Israel walk through the wilderness, over and over again, they get into wars, and who is the deciding factor in those wars? It's God who decides who wins and who loses. I was just reading Judges chapter 6 recently. It's about Gideon. And in Gideon's story, the Midianites, who are a nomad tribe, come out of nowhere and conquer part of Israel. They're not powerful enough to do that on their own. But God enabled them to, and so they did. God has already won. He's already finished the battle, and so he gives it into the hands of Israel if they're willing to take it. That's the question for them. It's not a matter of their military strength and tearing down the wall. It's a matter of them going and trusting in the Lord that his salvation is already accomplished. Jesus' victory is already accomplished for us. You can make that parallel pretty easily. He's already won. He's already defeated death. He's already defeated Satan. God has already finished the battle. It's up to us to follow Jesus and accept the victory if we want it. Doesn't mean there are no skirmishes to fight. It doesn't mean Israel doesn't have to do anything here, but God's already won it. The situation is secure, and they can walk right in and take that city if they want to. But they have to follow the plan. And that's the one caveat that is so curious about this story. That God has in place a plan for Jericho and a plan for how Jericho will be destroyed. And it's not going to be according to human logic. It doesn't make any sense. What's the plan? It's not to build siege towers and go conquer it. The plan is to walk around it 13 times over the course of a week. And then it's going to fall after you shout really loudly. That doesn't work physically. I mean, it's not like the 13 rounds of the human beings. It's not going to shift the tectonic plates and make Jericho just collapse on itself. There's nothing physically practical about that that's going to actually cause them to win. But God said it would. And so it doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't matter if it doesn't really make sense to them. God says it will work. And if you follow God, then you see that things work out. A lot of people have questions about Christianity today. How does that work? Some people have questions and have asked me, how does baptism remove your sins? It's a physical washing in physical water to remove a spiritual malady. And my answer is, I don't really know. But God said it works. And I'm going to trust that he knows what he's talking about. Because his plans don't have to rely on me. His plans don't have to rely on anything human. God has already won. He has promised the victory. And however he wants to accomplish that, that's up to him. We follow. What God says goes. Before the fight, here's what you do. Does it make sense? Not really. Go do it. And so Israel does. Pick up the reading with me in Joshua 6, starting in verse 6. Joshua the son of Nun summoned the priests, and he said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets in front of the ark of the Lord." He said to the troops, "Move forward, march around the city, have the armed men go ahead of the ark of the Lord." After Joshua had spoken to the troops, 7 priests, carrying 7 trumpets before the Lord, moved forward and blew the trumpets. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. And while the trumpets were blowing, the armed men went in front of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard went behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the troops, "Do not shout, or let your voice be heard. Don't let one word come out of your mouth until the time that I say, 'Shout,' and then you are to shout." So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once. They returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the trumpets were blowing, the armed men went in front of them, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. And on the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. Verse 15. Early on the 7th day, they started at dawn, and they marched around the city 7 times. That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. And after the 7th time, the priests blew the trumpet, and Joshua said to the troops, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of these things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. For all the silver and the gold, the articles of bronze and iron, they are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. So the troops shouted, And the trumpets sounded. When they heard the blast of the trumpet, the troops gave a great shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. They completely destroyed everything in the city with the sword, every man and woman, young and old, and every ox and sheep and donkey. It's interesting that every man can walk straight ahead into the city. That only happens if the whole wall falls down, except for one small section on the northern side of the wall, which most people think is where Rahab's house was, coincidentally enough. You see the plan here, and you see that the plan gets executed here, and you see that it all works perfectly fine. So here's some things you can take from that. First thing is you have to have a complete faith for this to work. I don't know if you notice it, because we kind of just read right over it. In verse 16, after they've accomplished the marching around the walls, and while the horns start blowing, Joshua says, "Now it's time to shout. The Lord has given the city to you." But the walls don't fall down until verse 20. When they're told to shout, when they're told to rejoice and be thankful for their victory, the walls are still up. It doesn't look like anything's changed. They've spent a whole week every day walking around the city once, until the last day where they walk around the city 7 times, and now the trumpets are going, and now there's some vague noise in the camp, and nothing's happened until they do something. Until they do what God has commanded for them to do. Human beings, as a rule, don't like to do that. We like to wait and see what happens, and we like to wait and see the results of something, and we see whether something works or not, and then we commit to it. That's not really how God works. Sometimes God wants you to act in faith before you can see whether or not something works. If I were to buy a computer, which I have unfortunately had to buy several in my lifetime, you don't hope that that works. You don't commit to buying something before you can turn it on and see that all the buttons function and see that everything runs just fine. And then you decide to keep that thing. And then you decide to pay the money for it. You wait until you see before you actually engage. But we're supposed to walk by faith and not by sight. Shout, "The Lord has given you the city." It doesn't look like it. Okay, are you going to shout? Do you have the kind of faith that's willing to step out and trust that God knows what he's doing? Or do you have to wait and be shown that God knows what he's doing before you're willing to respond to him? This only works because Israel has a faith in God. Surprisingly for these people, but they do have their faith, and it does end up working. It's not just faith, though. You have to add in that there has to be a complete obedience to everything that has just happened. Only when the troops shout, after walking around the city so many times, according to the will of God, does that fall over. Israel is willing to suspend their disbelief for a whole week and follow God and do exactly what he says. They walk around the city once and only once every day. You can't walk around twice on Monday and go no times on Tuesday. That's not how it works. God said, "Here's how it goes," and Israel did it. And because they followed the plan perfectly, God collapsed the city wall. Some people, especially some versions of Christianity, have this whole idea that faith alone saves you. I agree with that to some extent, because faith leads to action. If Israel just believed that God would collapse the city wall and they stand back and watch, it doesn't happen. But instead, God promises, if you do something, I will help you. Israel stepped forward in faith. They engaged with God, and God helped them. They did not earn their victory. They didn't collapse the wall. They're not the ones who did all the work for it. But God did require a response from them in order for him to engage with his half of the work. We human beings, we do not earn our salvation. We all know that. But God still requires something of us before he gives it to us. Complete faith and complete obedience. That's what's required of Israel, along with the third thing is complete submission to who God is. You notice these verses 17 through 19. Joshua, in the midst of, hey, you're ready to conquer the city, but here's some rules for you. I know what you're ready to do is go in and capture what is there, but there are laws on how you go about doing that. In most cities in the ancient world, for most peoples, if you conquer a city, then you go in and you get to reap the rewards of it. You get the money that's in the city, you get the people that are in the city, you get the animals that are in the city. You take all of those things out. They're a blessing to you for the work you did. Israel was not allowed to do that. You have to submit your desires to God. He said no. Jordan next week will be preaching on one man who did not submit his desires to God. And you can guess how that went. But I'll leave that for him next Sunday evening. God requires a complete submission of your will to him, not merely in your faith in who he is, not merely in your obedience to his plan, but giving him your desires and letting him tell you how to use them. We all have desires, and we all know that there are some desires that should not be gratified, or at least not in the ways in which we want them to be. God expects us to tame those things and to give them to him. He instructs us on where to channel those things. He instructs us on how to live. Submit to him, and he will help you. If Israel is not faithful in this fight, they don't win Jericho. If Israel is not obedient in this fight, they do not win Jericho. If Israel does not submit in this fight, consequences happen. That's next week. You can't miss any of those things and be faithful to God. That's what he's expecting. If you're going through this life, if you're going through the spiritual war, but you don't have faith in God and you're not obedient to him and you're not submitting your desires to him, you're going to run into problems. Jericho is a reminder to us. During the fight, trust in God and listen to him because he knows what he's doing. Even if it doesn't make sense that the walls collapse after you walk around them enough times, he can do it if he wants to. Follow him and see how he works it out. So you've seen before the fight, the battle plan. You see during the fight, as soon as they shout, the wall collapses and the troops walk in and they conquer it. But in the midst of that, as they're performing the slaughter, as they're finishing off those things, and yes, that's a whole different question, but I don't have time to go into the ethics of that, so we'll leave that for a different stage. You notice Joshua needs to wrap up the fight, and he makes a few notes at the end of it, and he starts those notes in verse 22. Joshua takes the two men aside. He says to the two men who had scouted out the land, "Go to the prostitute's house, bring that woman out of here and all who are with her, just as you swore to her." So the young men who had scouted went in, and they brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. They brought out her whole family, and they settled them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city and everything in it, but they put the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. However, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her father's family, and all that belonged to her, because she hid the messengers Joshua had sent to spy on Jericho, and she still lives in Israel today. That was true at that time, not true anymore, but it was true at the moment at which this was written. Verse 26, at that time Joshua imposed this curse. The man who undertakes the rebuilding of the city of Jericho, is cursed before the Lord. He will lay its foundation at the cost of his firstborn. He will finish its gates at the cost of his youngest. And the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. The battle itself is kind of a footnote that happens. I don't know if you noticed that or not. The walls collapse, they walk in, everybody dies, Israel wins. That's just a given. It's been a given since verse 2, and God said it would happen. And so we don't need the details of that battle. All we need is a summary statement saying, hey, it worked. That's not the important thing. The important thing is found in those notes of faith beforehand and in this cleanup period afterwards. And the first thing that you see in this period as the fight is finishing up is that God has mercy on the faithful sinners. That's an odd thing to put in Jericho. That's an odd part of this story. It doesn't seem to make sense. You're supposed to go in, Israel was supposed to go in and annihilate the Canaanites. And yet, the first city they conquer, the sinner who repents, God spares her and her family. There is mercy on her. You know who Rahab is? She is a sinner with a repugnant lifestyle, one might say. Not a good person, but she has some inklings of faith in God. You saw it in chapter 2. She knew of God. She knew that God was terrifying and had enough faith to save the spies, although there are questions about how she went through that. Again, that's a lesson for later. Her faith in God led her to do what she could to save the spies. And that faith of God ends up resulting in her redemption. The enemies of God who are willing to turn to him get spared. The sinners who repent do not suffer the wrath of the Lord. That's always been a promise. That will always be the promise. And it's a good thing too, because we're all in that situation. I mean, think about Israel. The people of Israel in the wilderness period were not exactly the most faithful of beings, not exactly the most righteous, not the most prone to obedience and glorifying the Lord. And yet, when they repented, God forgave them, and he still works with them, and he still lives in their presence. Rahab, when she turns to God with the little faith that she has, is saved after the end of all of this. God forgives those who turn to him. The question is, will you turn? There is mercy for the faithful sinner, the one who is willing to repent. Nobody's too far gone. If somebody was too far gone, Rahab would probably be too far gone. But she returns to the Lord. And so you can too. And it's interesting to see Joshua's command here as well in verse 22. He says to the spies, go to her house and bring them out. It's not wait for her to come out. It is go to her and bring the sinners out. That's a really weird call for evangelism in the Old Testament, but I think it's there. The faithful ones go into the burning city and they save the sinner before the sinner meets a terrible fate. So the spies go in and they proclaim mercy on the faithful one. Sinners are brought back, and she becomes a part of the Israelite camp. One of her children down the line a little bit is Boaz, who's a man like God. After Boaz, a few generations later, is David, a man after God's own heart. And then in quite a few generations after that is Jesus, the man who is God. Faithful sinners have a use. Faithful sinners are worthwhile. And so God spares her. But there is also a curse on those who are not faithful. A curse on the willingly rebellious, you might say. It's in verse 26. As Joshua stands, he proclaims over the ruin of the city that they have burned to death. And yes, in ancient Jericho, there are burn marks indicating that someone torched that city at some point. Joshua imposes a curse upon the city. The one who rebuilds the city, his oldest and his youngest will die. Laying its foundation, the first step, from what I understand, his oldest son will die. Finishing the gates, I think that's the last thing to happen, and that's where the youngest son dies. But of course, the city is rebuilt at some point later on. You see it in 1 Kings 16 and verse 34, if you want to look that up. In the days of Ahab, we've spent the last couple of Sunday morning Bible classes talking about Ahab and his impact on faithlessness in his day. In the days of King Ahab, one man named Hiel the Bethelite rebuilds the city. And when he lays its foundation, he loses his oldest son. And when he finishes its gates, he loses his youngest. The curse is true. The sons were lost, but he built it anyway. You think you might rethink it after the first one goes. But if anyone returns to what God has condemned, and if anyone goes back to what God has destroyed, and if anyone rebuilds again the thing that God has removed, he is cursed. Various references in the New Testament to that idea. If you become a Christian and then forsake it and leave it to go back to what you were before, you're even worse off than you were if you had never become a Christian in the first place. Don't go back to what God has destroyed. Don't rebuild Jericho, literally or figuratively. Rebuilding what God destroys is an evil thing, and that puts you against God. There are curses for that. But the last thing there is to say, or at least the last thing I'll point out for this section, is that little phrase in verse 27 that the Lord ends up being with Joshua, and his fame spreads throughout the land. That last note at the very end of the story tells you that there is a blessing, a special blessing that is given to those who are loyal in their leadership towards God. Joshua headed up this battle, and so Joshua at the end of it gets glorified for the victory. He didn't come up with the plan. He wasn't the one who collapsed the wall. He wasn't the one who enabled any of this to happen, and yet God brings him glory anyway. Because what Joshua did is stand and inspire faith in the people. What Joshua did was guide the people to faithfulness. I mean, do you really think all of Israel, with their questionable track record, do you think they looked at the city of Jericho and all said, yeah, we can take that, that's going to be easy? How many dissenters do you think there were? How many people were kind of questioning that and on the edge that Joshua had to work with? That he had to say, no, we are going to take this. No, we are able to do that because the Lord is with us. He tried it in Numbers 14. They weren't willing to listen to him there. They got cursed for it. But he does it again in Joshua 6, and they are willing to listen to his guidance. God's people benefit when we have faithful leadership to help inspire us and bring us along. Don't be someone who begrudges that. Follow your leaders. There's a reason elders are appointed in every church. That's what Paul and Barnabas do on their way back in Acts 13 and 14. They go through, they build churches, and then they come back through and appoint elders everywhere. Why? Because faithful leaders are a real blessing. And so if one of the elders is trying to guide you towards something, hey, maybe listen to them. They're trying to help you. If somebody else is trying to give you some insight or some wisdom, is trying to inform you in a particular direction, is trying to spiritually help you out, don't instantly reject that. Pay attention to that and maybe listen. Not every bit of advice is going to be good, granted, but there is a real blessing in having good leadership that pushes you towards a higher standard of faith. Joshua pushed Israel to that, and Israel conquered Jericho because of it. And if he can do that, what could God still do today? The question of Jericho is it's not really a story about walls falling down. It's not really a story about one city getting conquered. It's not really a story about, Joshua entering the land of Canaan. It's a story about God testing Israel's faith to see if they're going to listen. And it is a test that Israel does successfully pass this time. The story of Jericho for us today ought not to be merely a children's story that is taught in Bible class because it's fun to knock the bricks down and then you laugh at it and then you move on. It's a challenge for you today. It's a test of your faith. Do you have the kind of faith that believes that God can remove your barriers and bring you to the promised land? Do you have the kind of faith that's willing to step forward even when you're not sure if it's going to work? You have the kind of faith that steps into the burning city to save the ones who are maybe faithful and bring them out back to the Lord. You have the kind of faith that looks at a 40-foot tall wall and says, yeah, I know that's big, but I have God on my side, and it's nothing. It's a test of faith for you, as well as Israel. They passed the test. Question is, will you? What kind of obstacles have come up in your life that have kind of taken you back a step pushed you backwards and maybe they've made you falter a little bit. Do you think God can't overrun those? Do you think God's incapable of bringing those down? He could build a ramp from the city wall. What can he not do for you? It's a question of Jericho. May you remember Jericho. May its image stand firmly in your mind. And think upon that the next time your faith is tested. Because yes, God is big enough that he can fix any problems that you have. If there's any question of faith, if there's any difficulty you've had in following the Lord, if you've stumbled somewhere along the way and you want to get back up and get back to it, if you want to make that known in a public manner, you're more than free to. I'll be standing right here. You just come up and come talk to me. Let's work through it and let's get you back going towards God. I'll be right here as we all stand and sing this song.